Hey everyone, it's Richard watching The Plain Bagel. We have officially passed Donald Trump's August 1st deadline for trade deals, and as was promised, have seen a slew of new tariffs announced for anyone who hadn't reached a deal by this point, except for Mexico, who managed to get another 90-day pause. With the administration announcing that the 10% universal tariff that was in place during the suspension of the Liberation Day tariffs will continue as the minimum tariff for all trade partners, specifically those who the US had a trade surplus against, while also releasing a list of countries and their updated tariff rates, many of whom would now have a minimum 15% tariff, with Syria, Laos, and Switzerland being among some of the hardest hit with roughly 40% rates. And not far off from the top of this list was none other than Canada, notably one of the only countries aside from China who retaliated against Trump's tariffs with tariffs of their own and is now seemingly being punished for it, with the country unable to secure a trade deal despite months of negotiations, and Trump signing a separate executive order to increase the country's tariff rate from 25% to now 35% effective August 1st. Which naturally is pretty big news. Canada is one of America's largest trade partners and is heavily dependent on the United States, sending roughly 3/4 of its exports south of the border, which has led many to wonder, what now? A 35% tariff rate sounds pretty detrimental, if not completely inhibitive, to cross-border trade. And indeed, we've seen a lot of posts circulate lamenting, criticizing Canada for not reaching a deal here, or just generally expressing fear around the deep contraction the country might experience in its economy. And while there's certainly risk around a recession here, I wanted to post a video to discuss some of the nuance of the current US-Canada trade relation here, because we're seeing a lot of details glossed over, with one example of that being that this headline 35% rate that we're now obviously seeing in the news doesn't really represent the rate most Canadian exporters are seeing on their exports to the US. In fact, with this update, Canada has likely become one of the lowest tariff exporters to the United States, with its forecasted effective tariff rate actually falling below that 10% minimum set by Donald Trump, with it being one of the few countries to still have some free trade access to the market. Which is why I wanted to post this video to clear up confusion around the rates Canada is actually facing with trade in the US, where the US-Canada relationship on trade currently stands, and where Canada can go from here. But first, a quick recap of how we got here. As you might remember, a lifetime ago, back in February 2025, Trump first imposed tariffs of 25% on most products coming from Canada, alongside other tariff announcements for Mexico and China, with energy, critical minerals, and potash instead being hit with a lower 10% rate because of, quote, the flow of illicit drugs across our northern border. With the US accusing Canada of contributing to America's opioid epidemic, despite the border representing less than 1% of fentanyl seizures, which would prove just one of the fairly dubious claims we'd see in the months that would follow with this trade dispute, including the assertion that the US was subsidizing Canada to the effect of $200 billion, that US banks weren't allowed to operate in Canada, and that US dairy farmers were charged exorbitant tariffs, even though Canada maintained a very low effective tariff rate on US imports, and the US was only using a fifth of its allotted tariff-free quota for milk. With all this, of course, being made all the more bitter with the comments of annexing Canada. Nonetheless, despite many Canadians questioning the reasoning behind it, the country now saw this additional 25% tariff and would see further escalations down the line, including the US increasing its anti-dumping and countervailing tariffs, or tariffs that look to offset government subsidies on Canadian softwood, and the introduction of a number of sector-specific tariffs, of which Canada was a key supplier, including steel and aluminum tariffs, first set at 25% and now recently raised to 50%, and a 25% tariff on auto parts. Albeit the recently announced copper tariffs actually don't have a very meaningful impact on Canada, despite it being a key industry for the country, with the recently announced update specifically targeting semi-finished copper products like pipes and wiring, rather than the raw and refined copper that Canada primarily exports. Now, Canada, for its part, as mentioned, did retaliate with a more selective list of products, introducing a 25% tariff on 30 billion Canadian dollars worth of goods on March 4th, followed by a 25% tariff on 30 billion Canadian dollars of steel and aluminum products on March 13th, and finally a 25% tariff on auto and auto parts on April 9th. And while the country was spared from many Liberation Day announcements, we did see some moments of headbutting in the months that followed, including the digital services tax, which Canada ultimately scrapped after Donald Trump raised some hell over that. And recently, Canada's announcement that it would recognize a Hamas-free Palestinian state should hostages be released, which Trump announced would make it very hard for the US to now make a trade deal with the country. Which brought us to this past week when on July 31st, Trump signed the executive order increasing the tariff rate on Canadian goods, with Trump once again citing the flow of drugs from Canada into the United States, as well as Canada's tariff retaliation, and hiking the country's broad-based 25% tariff to 35%, with the order also highlighting that any exports sent through another country to circumvent these duties would instead face a 40% transshipment charge. Now, importantly, these tariffs are not stacked on top of sector-specific tariffs, and the rates are only applied to products that previously saw this 25% broad-based tariff, meaning that goods like energy, potash, and critical minerals will still see only that 10% tariff rate when imported into the United States. Nonetheless, it was, of course, a negative update for Canada, with Prime Minister Mark Carney highlighting that he was disappointed with the outcome, and the Canadian stock market, the TSX Composite, falling 1% on the Friday. And again, with the country sending roughly 3/4 of its exports south of the border, representing roughly a fifth of its economy, it's led to some heightened anxieties. But again, as highlighted, there are some important caveats to discuss here. Regarding the rate, for example, as mentioned, even with this escalation, Canada actually has some of the best access to the US market from an export standpoint. And it's all thanks to CUSMA compliance. You see, 2 days after Trump's first 25% tariff on Canada initially kicked in back in March, the president issued an amendment to his executive order highlighting that goods that trade under the USMCA trade agreement, known as the CUSMA agreement here in Canada, will continue to be tariff-free, with this, of course, being the free trade agreement signed by Canada, the US, and Mexico back during Trump's initial first term. And while this exemption was initially intended to be temporary, it's been kept in place since, and now seemingly has been extended to apply to this recent update, meaning that a good chunk of Canadian products still enter the US tariff-free. In fact, as highlighted by Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, the vast majority of the province's exports, which includes most of Canada's oil and gas exports, continue to enter the US tariff-free, with this energy representing by far the country's largest export category to the US. So just how much of Canada's exports to the United States fall under this agreement? Well, currently, it might be a lower percentage than you'd expect. While it might sound like a sort of broad-based and comprehensive trade deal, there is a lot of trade that takes place outside of the confines of the agreement, with only 38% of Canadian exports to the United States taking advantage of this exemption as of 2024. That being said, however, it's very likely we see that figure move much higher. You see, being CUSMA compliant requires that a product goes through a certification process to ensure that it meets certain sourcing requirements, namely its inputs and labor need to be predominantly from Canada, the US, or Mexico, the members of the agreement. And according to RBC, the vast majority of Canadian exports, roughly 94%, meet CUSMA requirements. However, because trade outside the agreement was only subject to a most favored nation tariff rate that was typically free or very low, often just a few percentage points prior to 2025, most exporters didn't bother go through the process, with many exporters just deeming the extra paperwork not worth the relatively small fee. However, as tariffs have increased, that's naturally changed, with us seeing a wave of exporters rushing to become CUSMA compliant to take advantage of these tariff exemptions. And even with the 25% tariffs in place since March, Canada has only seen an average weighted tariff rate on its exports to the United States of around 5% year to date, according to the Bank of Canada. Now, of course, because some of those months were pre-trade war, that's naturally going to skew some of the figures. And I have seen some other estimates from, for example, the Budget Lab at Yale, which puts Canada's current effective tariff rate at 13% after last week's announcement. But it's expected that we're going to continue to see higher and higher CUSMA compliant trading, with RBC estimating that the vast majority of exports, around 86% of what Canada sends to the US, will fall under this agreement, with Scotiabank estimating that Canada's effective tariff rate will only be 6 to 7% following the recent hikes, which would mean despite the retaliation and the inability to secure a new deal here, Canada would face one of the lowest tariff rates among US trade partners, even those who have committed to investing directly in the country. Now, importantly, that's not to argue that Canada has outsmarted the US here or won't experience a negative impact from the tariff escalations. The country did, for example, experience an 11% year-over-year decline in exports in April following the initial implementation of tariffs, and the country is estimated to have seen its GDP contract 1.5% in the second quarter year-over-year, which is a stark difference to the US, which recently reported a 3% jump in GDP. Also, while we would expect exporters to continue to try and become CUSMA compliant, there will be some who aren't able to achieve that, with, for example, small and medium businesses who might not be able to source inputs all domestically or within North America, or just companies who haven't kept good record of their sourcing, given that we're now seeing higher scrutiny at the border. And even with this caveat around the CUSMA agreement, there's still going to be those sector-related headwinds, namely with steel and aluminum, which faces that 50% Section 232 tariff regardless of CUSMA compliance, lumber, which again faces that anti-dumping tariff, which kind of stems from a long-standing dispute between the two countries, and auto parts, which are only tariff-free under CUSMA for their US-sourced components. And again, these sector-specific tariffs do target some important Canadian industries. In 2024, Canada exported $4.6 billion of softwood lumber, $15.6 billion of auto parts, and $16.5 billion of steel and aluminum to the United States, all of which together represents 9% of Canada's exports, or around 2% of the country's GDP, which will have a meaningful impact on the provinces and a devastating impact on the small communities who depend on these select industries, even if the scale sounds small at the aggregate level. Still, it does go to highlight that this 35% tariff is not going to be an effective rate we see across all industries that export to the US. Again, Canada does have actually a preferred status, interestingly enough, with US trade here. It's also worth noting that despite the deadline, negotiations are likely going to be ongoing here. Canada is still a big supplier to the US in terms of a number of key categories. It supplies around half of America's aluminum needs, a quarter of softwood lumber needs, over 80% of potash consumption, and is a key provider of a number of other resources, including electricity and uranium, which means that the US is going to experience an inflationary impact from these tariffs and may give Canada some negotiating leeway. So while Canada is more dependent on the US for trade than vice versa, it still goes to show that there might be reason to negotiate in the future, as it will take many years to build out the infrastructure necessary to replace certain trade partners in these areas. And while US inflation has so far been relatively controlled, that seems mostly in part due to companies absorbing a lot of the cost increases, hoping that the situation proves to be temporary. And if these policies hold, that's not going to prove sustainable over time. Nonetheless, the situation is very volatile, as we've seen in the past, very prone to changes last minute, and we could certainly see this situation change. For example, as mentioned, the CUSMA exemption was initially intended to be temporary, so we could see that revoked at some point, which would be much more impactful to Canadian trade. And with the agreement set to be reviewed a year from now in July 2026, we could very well see the US push for further concessions as that framework comes up for discussion. Nonetheless, as I've highlighted in the past for the viewers who are thinking about buying a boat and just living on it as all this blows over, Canada has gone through periods of high US tariffs in the past, and there may be a number of levers the country is able to pull here, with the provinces looking to reduce internal trade barriers, the federal government continuing to talk to expand trade with other countries, and internally enacting support measures for impacted industries and businesses, including enhancements to the country's employment insurance programs. And while the biggest barrier to Canada diversifying its trade has historically been its infrastructure's reliance on the US, if the country is able to develop out its infrastructure as Prime Minister Mark Carney has promised, we could eventually see the country reduce its reliance on the US here. Nonetheless, as with many of these types of events, very difficult to forecast the impact on inflation, the impact on GDP, and how future negotiations and geopolitical relations end up playing out. So we'll ultimately have to wait and see. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, please do make sure to like, subscribe, all that good stuff. It does help the channel tremendously. And let me know your thoughts on all of this, whether you agree or disagree. Again, as a Canuck myself, I'm going to have a lot of bias with all this. And to my American viewers, I know once again, we find ourselves sadly on either sides of the trench here, but very open to having opposing views discussed in the comments down below. Thanks again for joining, and as always, be safe out there.